about the encroachment of the sacred Black Hills, which at that time they discovered gold here. And through the 1868 treaties, they said the whole Black Hills belonged to the Lakota people. All of a sudden, gold discovered, so they're all encroaching it. They broke their promise, of this. And he wanted to know what to do with it. I mean, what they should do. That's what he did, the flesh offerings at the Sundance. And on the second day, he started to have these visions of the future. And on the third day, he had a vision of soldiers falling into camp upside down with no ears. They're like grasshoppers, he said. And the voice came to him and he says, I give you these for they have no ears. And he didn't know, what they meant, but, you don't question the spirit when he gives you an answer. So it was not long after that, Crook was coming up the Rosebud River with his 2,000 troops. And the Lakota seen him, so they went and then the historians, they tell these big stories. They got 1,000 Lakota warriors. It was, I always tell people, the Lakota Cheyennes of the Northern Plains here, they were guerrilla fighters on the back of a horse. Now, if you know what a guerrilla fighter is, I was in Vietnam and I know what guerrilla fighters are.
Yes.
They'll be like 10, 20, maybe 30. And they hit you in strategic areas and make you think you're doing battle with 2,000 troops out there, when actually it's just groups that hit you at certain places and they disrupt your thinking, your march, or whatever you might say. And that's what they did to Crook. So he had to turn around. He went back to Laramie, Fort Laramie. So, but this was not the vision he had. He said this can't be it because they all left. They didn't die. So then the food was running out, and the horses, the grazing the grass. So they sent scouts in 4 directions to find out, where there's any game. And some scouts came back from the west and said towards what they call the Prejisla, which is where the grass is greasy looking. They call it, And they said there's a big herd of antelope there. So they said, we would go out there and then the grass is plentiful along the creek, river there. So they moved the whole camp. And it wasn't like they say in history books, they always say, there's thousands of warriors. It wasn't true because these guys that came to my grandfather, he sent out word to come join him. So a lot of them, at that time, most of the natives were at these agencies, like Pine Ridge Agency, Rosebud, Cheyenne River, and Standing Rock. They all have agencies where they have forts and little Indian agents who fed them cattle, to be around there and try to assimilate them into being Americanized. But a lot of them didn't want that, so they heard word, so they'd slip away with their families and they'd join Sitting Bull over, up on Montana along the Yellowstone River there. And they'd just show up. They had more horses than people. So they went further west and they found the herd of antelope. So they were feasting on antelope, and camped along the western edge of the Little Bighorn River there. And biggest, I guess the one that had the bigger tribe of people were the Ukpapa, Sitting Bull's people that were in the southern end. Campers to the south, they always scouted, so they were on the south. And up along the river there, just spread out. They wouldn't just cut together, they would just spread out along the trees there. And, you had different nations there. You had Oglalas, Mikojus. You had, the Rosebud, the Sichanku, and then you had Cheyennes and Arapahoes show up. And, they didn't show up just in groups. They showed up as individuals. They had horses and they'd show up. And they might see somebody they knew and they'd say, come, camp next to us over here. So they'd camp. So it was just a social gathering kind of a thing. And what he was doing was when he got a certain day, he wanted to have a big meeting and with the people to see what they can do with this encroachment of the Black Hills. But they didn't know that Custer was coming up. He was slipping up on them and he seen them there. And Custer had ignored the commands from higher command that he's supposed to wait for Terry and Gibbon to show up so they could, hit him from all sides. This camp that when if they found it, and turns out he was egotistical and he worked his men to death trying to get there around horseback, and they got up there in time on June 25th. They attacked. A three-pronged attack he created, and it didn't work. And at that time, the men of fighting age, I guess you might say, ranging from late teenage years to, late 50s, the men in these camps, the Cheyennes, the Lakota, numbered around 800. And that's about almost the same amount of troops as Custer's command. But he split them up. He had like 200 something guys. So they, Gibbon went one way. Reno went one way, and the captain went the other side, and Custer went the other way. They're going to try to attack the village from three different sides. But the first one was Reno, and he got chased back, because, he attacked and they overwhelmed him. And then goes to my great-grandfather, my granduncles. They were there, and they were just young boys. And they heard the shooting going on in the south. To the north, they had this big corral built up with ropes. And all the people left their horses up there so that, most of the horses, because most of these families had anywhere from 2 to 3 horses, maybe some of them 4. They carried their teepees and carried them and whatever. And, it might be a family with, that many horses. So they had them in this big corral up there, and they were like guarding them, the young men. And then they heard this little pop in this to the south. These granduncles were telling me this when I was like 5, 6 years old. We lived on a reservation, and they used to come to our house, and they talked about this. One of my granduncles was a deaf mute, and he didn't speak English. He didn't speak any language. So they would use hand signals, talk with hand gestures. And my mother knew how to do this, so she'd sit there and listen to him. And afterwards, when they never slept in the house. They slept out there in their teepee, in their tents she had set up. And they don't sleep on beds. They won't sit in chairs. They sat on the ground. These guys they lived another time. So at night, my mother would come in the house and tell us what they talked about, the stories they were telling. And she was telling us about the story about the little Bighorn, what they experienced, what they seen. They said they were there, they were herding the horses, and all of a sudden, young men come running up, a little older than they were, getting their horses, that were in the crowd there to join the fight. They said there was some what they call them mila huska, long knives. They were attacking in the south into the Hunkpapa village. So they were getting the horses to join the fight, and a lot of them got their horses and they headed south. They headed towards that battle. And all of a sudden, he said, this place, if you've ever been to the Little Bighorn battlefield, there's a place called the Deep Ravine. It's just south of the visitor center there, kind of like a little gully down there. It's a ravine. And west of that river there is where the horses were kept in the corral. And my granduncle said they looked over to the east and they seen the column of soldiers coming. There were 4 abreast. And they yelled, "There's soldiers are coming, they're right there. They're right there on the eastern edge of the Little Bighorn." And so they had no modern weapons, so they had bow and arrows and stuff. So they started shooting at them. And then all of a sudden, a Winchester started firing south of them a little bit. You could hear the Winchester rifle, And said one of these guys in the column was shot off his horse. And then another one got shot off his horse. And then the group behind him grabbed the second one and put him back on his horse. And then the rout happened, he said. They just turned and started trying to get to the top of the hill. Before they got there, a group of warriors came up around them, and the fight was started. They left that one laying there, I guess he was killed. And he said they didn't know what. And then the young men come running up, getting their horses and joined the fight. He said all you heard was this constant roar of guns and dust flying everywhere. And he said it didn't take long. It was just over. He says, you hear shots going off now and then. And they didn't know who this column of soldiers were. So they crossed the river and they were laying dead. They were saying, they were telling about, how they were reacting, the soldiers. And one of my granduncles said, one of these soldiers got off his horse and shot the horse he was in the head, laid it down, used it for a barricade. And he had misty eyes. He said, it's that man. He said, when you do something like that, you're not going to see the sunset. He said, certain death for him. And he said, they fought bravely. He said, but they were all taken out. So they went through there, and all of a sudden they find Custer laying there. He had cut his hair short, and he didn't wear his signature buckskin coat that he wears. He was just like a regular soldier. He didn't even have that red scarf he always wore around his neck. He looked like a regular soldier. They didn't know he was Custer, and they didn't know who shot him, so they were how he was killed. But he had a bullet hole in his chest and one in his temple. And the Cheyenne women were just going after him because what he did at the Washita in Oklahoma, to the Cheyenne people. And they're putting skewers in his ears and putting things up his penis, and all this because he raped a lot of Cheyenne women. And I was telling this story at the Little Bighorn when we were in the process of putting up that Indian memorial, and there was a Cheyenne elder there. And he said, we know that story too. He said, just like you're saying. He said, the only thing is, he says, it was a Cheyenne girl who had a Winchester rifle who shot them two. And we said, and seeing the Custer buffs don't want to hear that because they don't want to hear the fact that he was the last guy on the hill with two guns blazing. And he was the first one to get shot off his horse. And he wasn't killed because that's what, and then the other guy, the first guy that they shot was one of his scouts. His name was Bergier or something like that. He was half French and half Lakota. He was one of his scouts, Indian scouts, and he was killed. And in 2007, they found his skull down there in the deep ravine. They were walking around there and they found this partial skull laying down there, human skull. They did a test on it and knew it was a native. So that's who he was because they didn't know whatever happened to that guy, And so this is our story of what happened.